Welcome to this explainer. Right now, we're looking at a world that is experiencing a highly volatile period with some pretty massive developments happening across multiple fronts all at once. And I get it, it's really easy to look at the news and think of these events as isolated incidents happening, thousands of miles away. But the reality, these seemingly distant global conflicts are directly impacting your daily life, your wallet, and our domestic economy. Today, we're going to trace that exact path. We'll look at the data, the policies, and the shifting power dynamics to really understand this massive ripple effect currently sweeping the globe.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the Middle East on the brink. Second, global economic shockwaves. Third, U.S. domestic legal battles. Fourth, the 2028 political landscape. And finally, shifting global power dynamics. Section 1, Middle East on the brink. Where we're seeing ceasefires collapsing, we're heading straight to the absolute epicenter of the current geopolitical turmoil, which is the incredibly precarious situation in the Persian Gulf. Right now, a very tenuous peace is unraveling rapidly. The situation escalated fast when U.S. forces carried out defensive airstrikes targeting missile launch sites and mine-laying boats in southern Iran, while also taking out attack drones. In response to that, Iran's Revolutionary Guards claimed they targeted an American airbase. But the real climax happened on May 27 when Iran launched a ballistic missile toward Kuwait, which thankfully was successfully intercepted. Now, what's absolutely crucial to understand here is the shift in the U.S. response. Previously, officials kind of tried to downplay provocations to keep the truce alive. But following this May 27th launch, U.S. Central Command came out with a rare, strongly worded statement, calling it an egregious ceasefire violation. It's a crystal clear signal that Washington's patience is wearing incredibly thin.
And that loss of patience brings us right to the U.S. strategy for the Strait of Hormuz. The administration has just flatly refused any tolling system in these international waters. Enter what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has dubbed Operation Economic Fury. It's an intense, multi-pronged siege strategy. I mean, the Iranian economy is in total freefall, literally to the point where troops are going unpaid. Key infrastructure, like Karg Island, has been completely shut down. The U.S. has sanctioned Iran's newly created Persian Gulf Straits Authority, outright labeling it a joke. And perhaps most significantly, they've dropped a comprehensive naval blockade, a so-called wall of steel, which is driving the amount of Iranian crude on the water to a record low.
And this brilliantly illustrates why a 60-day memorandum of understanding to extend the truce is completely deadlocked right now. We are looking at fundamentally incompatible core demands. On one side, the U.S. is going with a hardline, no dust, no dollars policy, basically demanding Iran destroy or hand over its highly enriched uranium before getting access to any frozen funds. On the flip side, Iran's explicitly stated red line is their absolute right to enrich uranium and maintain those stockpiles. Both sides are completely digging in here, with experts suggesting Tehran might just be using delay tactics to wait out the current U.S. administration. But the Persian Gulf isn't the only front we're watching. Let's shift our focus over to Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has just directed the Israeli Defense Forces to take over 70% of Gaza's territory. He has publicly stated the intention to tighten their grip step by step. Now, this 70% directive pushes significantly past the yellow line that was established during the October 2025 ceasefire agreement, which originally demarcated 53% Israeli control. Hamas has fiercely condemned this move, arguing that it aims to entrench permanent military control and force the Palestinian population into a drastically shrinking enclave. And then we have the Lebanon front, where a U.S. brokered truce has just completely collapsed. Listen to this massive number. 2,000 square kilometers. That is the size of the expanding Israeli airstrike buffer zone in Lebanon. To put that into perspective, it now covers approximately 1/5 of the entire country. This expansion, up from the initial 600 square kilometer zone, has displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians and triggered a really severe, rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis. Section 2, Global Economic Shockwaves and the Cost of Chaos. So you might be wondering, how does all this military posturing halfway across the world actually affect you? Let's take a look. If we track April's economic indicators, the PCE price index is up 3.8%, which is the largest rise since May 2023, driven largely by surging energy prices, and it's pushing inflation to a 3-year high. Core PCE, which excludes the more volatile stuff like food and energy, is also up at 3.3%. But the most alarming spike here by far is in retail gasoline prices, jumping a massive 12.3%. And the data connects this severe spike directly to those shipping bottlenecks and the military posturing we just talked about in the Strait of Hormuz. That blockade and the massive geopolitical risk are literally driving up the cost of the gas you put in your car every week.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the glaring paradox we're seeing in our economy right now. Despite a wildly chaotic global supply chain, despite shortages in everyday goods, from fertilizers all the way to aluminum, and despite hitting a 3-year inflation peak, the U.S. stock market remains hovering near record highs. Corporate profits for major companies have been incredibly resilient, keeping major indices like the S&P 500 totally insulated, at least for the moment, from the oil market's extreme volatility. It's a wild contrast.
Section 3. U.S. domestic legal battles, specifically looking at the home front, because while the global economy wrestles with these supply chain nightmares, the U.S. administration is heavily engaged in some intense activity right here at home. Currently, the Department of Justice is rapidly widening its legal battle against several Democratic-led states over immigration policies. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche has actually filed separate lawsuits against Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon, and Washington. The core of the federal government's argument here is that these states are imposing unconstitutional restrictions, specifically by denying undercover license plates to Department of Homeland Security components, which includes ICE. The DOJ is arguing that these state policies directly threaten the safety of federal agents and totally undermine the federal government's exclusive power over border control.
In another major legal development, the whole E. Jean Carroll saga has taken some completely new turns. First, you probably remember the $83.3 million defamation verdict awarded to Carroll. Well, now, the DOJ has opened a perjury investigation into Carroll to determine if she lied under oath by allegedly concealing that an organization backed by Reid Hoffman actually helped fund her legal fees. And finally, the appeals court has just allowed President Trump to delay paying that massive $83.3 million award pending a Supreme Court review. But that's provided he posts a $7.4 million bond just to cover the ongoing interest costs.
Section 4. The 2028 political landscape. Because all of these legal and economic maneuvers for sure play right into the wider political landscape. Let's take a quick look ahead. Now, 2028 might feel pretty far away right now, but the board is already being set. Listen to this decisive statement from Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Quote, "I think there will be a robust group of people running for president. I will not be one of them in 2028. This formal declaration is massive news. It officially removes a highly formidable contender, someone who secured really decisive victories in a critical battleground state, from what is expected to be a very, very crowded Democratic primary field. Section 5. Shifting global power dynamics. Let's zoom back out for a second and look at the new chessboard to truly understand the sheer scope of the administration's current agenda.
Right now, we are witnessing a stunning structural overhaul of U.S. commitments abroad. The Pentagon has officially announced a plan to reduce U.S. military capabilities made available to NATO by up to half, 50%. This includes pulling back strategic bombers, fighter jets, and naval assets. Now, the administration is framing this withdrawal not as a retreat, but as a very deliberate pressure campaign. The goal? To force European allies to step up and assume primary responsibility for their own conventional defense, essentially holding them strictly to their past summit pledges.
And this massive reduction in Europe is happening alongside a really severe strain on U.S. munitions. So on one side, you have Ukraine's President Zelensky persistently and urgently requesting more Patriot air defense missiles to fend off the Russian invasion. But on the other side, the U.S. reality is that American munitions deliveries are falling dangerously short. Why? Because those stockpiles are actively being diverted to that escalating Iran conflict we discussed at the very top of this explainer. It's a tough situation. The U.S. simply has to choose where to send its limited defensive resources. At the exact same time, the scope of U.S. action is broadening rapidly across the Southern Hemisphere. Pushing back on some recent criticisms regarding USAID, the State Department has just committed $112 million to boost the Ebola response in Africa. Meanwhile, in a wildly aggressive Latin American strategy, U.S. forces have actually arrested Venezuela's president, with the administration essentially overseeing the country right now. And concurrently, Washington is heavily intensifying its pressure campaign on Cuba by actively blocking oil deliveries to the island. It is just a staggering, unprecedented reshuffling of diplomatic and military resources worldwide. Okay, amidst all this intense geopolitical chess, the crazy stock market paradoxes, and the domestic lawsuits, here is a surprising little palate cleanser for you. The New York Knicks are currently riding an incredible 11-game postseason winning streak. And right in the midst of everything else going on in the world, President Trump, a New York native himself, announced he's been invited by Knicks owner James Dolan to attend the NBA Finals at Madison Square Garden.
It's just a really fascinating intersection of intense national politics and the sports world colliding.
So, the crucial takeaway from all of this is that none of what we've covered today happens in a vacuum. From a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf sending your gas prices soaring, to critical military assets being pulled from NATO to handle a collapsing ceasefire, these threads are all deeply, deeply connected. Which leaves us with this final, vital question. How will these intersecting economic pressures and explosive geopolitical shifts ultimately reshape the new global order? It's a whole lot to process for sure, but understanding this underlying structure is the absolute key to navigating the news today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions and keep learning.